I think there are two vectors that I would like to bring in. And one of them is a new project that I've started, which sort of gets at a lot of these issues, and I call it ethics in the city. In other words, all those beautiful texts about ethics, useless, because they all stop short from the recognition that inevitably a city is a space of enormous inequalities. So then the question becomes, at what point does this enormity of inequalities reach a level where it becomes profoundly unacceptable? Secondly, profoundly destructive of the notion of the city itself. So, that is a bit abstract, but I completely agree with you that this is an issue that most urbanists do not quite confront. It's a tricky one. Now, on this side, I said two vectors. The other vector is that my experience with, and I talked a lot about low-income people, the disadvantaged. It's that there are these moments when the city really gets it wrong. The city as a complex system, complex but incomplete system. But there are many moments when the city, a park is a good, public transport, when we all become momentarily, the rich, the poor, the well-dressed, the badly dressed, urban subjects. And that to me is an anchor for a city. And it is inevitably a momentary. We cannot be full-time urban subjects. We're mothers, we're fathers, we're teenagers, we're artists, we're whatever, right? But the capacity of a complex, incomplete, messy, not fully controllable space, because if it doesn't have those elements, it's not a city, to generate us all as urban subjects. And the subway at rush hour, to me, is a great example, where you have all this mix of elements. Now, beyond that final point, we have got to deal, and this is my Who Owns the City project, we have to deal with the fact that buildings are sites for simply hoarding or storing capital, clean or dirty capital. Furthermore, and this is something that simply has not been written about, and it's crucial, those empty buildings we see in Manhattan, we tend to think, oh my God, poor investors. No. You know what is happening? They are functioning as components for asset-backed securities. They're going to be empty a lot, and they're making more money, the owners, the ones that can, than if they were renting them out or selling them out. Now, when you get that, you get a form of death. All those big empty towers, and that they are producing more money by being empty because then they can be used to create asset-backed security. Now, you tell me how we solve that one, because that is a tough one.
Fair enough, but I think I want to push the conversation towards what the motivations might be, what even the economic and capital motivations for people might be, with private interests, to create a more equitable and vibrant city. I think the issue of transportation came up. You mentioned streets in the video. And after all, public spaces are not just parks and squares, they're also the transit system. And if you look at a place like London, but I'm sure you could give me a million other examples where there have been investments in public transit, big ones. Those are not necessarily for people who ride in limousines from their $1 million apartments, right? But they produce both a more equitable city and a more profitable city. So I'd like to push you all towards answering a question which is not just, is it fair, but how is the functioning of a more equitable city with more vibrant, robust public spaces, how is this actually going to produce the sort of economic growth that will also help those citizens? So Richard, let me put that question to you.
Such a small question. And actually many questions. If I go back to what we could do, I'll tell you what several of the Quito Papers emphasize on the aspect of design and planning, which is somewhat, if we could solve your economic issue, what would we do? There are three, I would say, foci in these papers. One of them is about using public spaces in multiple ways. One of them is about loosening the knot between form and function, making more flexible forms of design. And the third is working with informality rather than working against it. Your transport example is a very good one. There is many of the transport people we talk to want to actually use public transport facilities as ways to organize public space. So they're not just about transport. And that if you need to visit a health clinic, that's in the same place where you take the bus to work. And that's an idea of making public space synchronous, so that, as I mentioned in the film, many things happen at the same time. Incomplete spaces, designing things that can morph into many directions, is against a lot of the way in which we think about planning, which is that you have an objective and then you design a space or a place which fulfills that objective. I was very struck when I first went to Shanghai that a friend of mine who was a chief planner of Shanghai said, I'm going to take you, if you want to know the problem we face, we're going to take a journey on a highway that was so beautifully built, so absolutely perfectly articulated. And he said, the end of our journey is going to be a factory. It's a very weak man. And we got to the end of the journey, and the factory was there and closed because the factory had moved to Vietnam. That typifies the kinds of problems we're having in urban development when you tight fit between form and function. You've got a factory, you've got to get your workers there, you spend millions on a transport system to do it, and the factory moves. So the second big issue that we're pursuing here is how to loosen that so that you can make investments, which is, as the city evolves, that the infrastructure itself
flexible, right?
It's flexible. And that's more difficult than you would think. It's like planning the DNA of something. Now, I'm not God. God did, perhaps, plan the DNA of things. But urban DNA, as opposed to this project-based way of thinking that we have now, making structures, streets, transport systems, buildings flexible, it's a real challenge, and you'll see some of the ways we approach that. The third thing I want to say is that, to me, the most malign forms of planning that we inherited from the 20th century was that informality is a sign that the city is going wrong. I think we need to work with open-air markets, with squatter settlements, rather than assume that these things are just signs of injury that have to be replaced by something formalized. That we need to find ways to develop them from within so that they become better quality, but that they still retain their DNA as something which is not controlled and not finished. And there's quite a lot of that. Again, is easier said than done. But these are the three kinds of emphases. Assuming we can solve Saskia's problem about capitalism, money, and justice, and so on, what would we then do? We would focus on synchronicity, incompleteness, flexibility, and informality as goods in the city.
So we're already doing that in some degree in places where there's some upgrading and so forth. But what my concern is how we blend and come up with the solutions that the open city provides, but the expertise of the urban designer also provides. So we need arenas in which we can have these discussions. We talk about civil society having a voice. We talk about businesses having a voice. We talk about governments having a voice. These are all very different groups. And so we need to find the way to come to listen to each other, to then figure out exactly what the solutions are. There's no expert top-down or bottom-up. It's somewhere in the middle. And so where are we going to find those arenas and the time that will take to do this? Because, as we know, we're built here in the developed world. It's Africa and Asia where this enormous pace of development is occurring. Where are we going to have time to do this? Well, Latin America's pretty well built, but still.
So you raised the very large issue of governance. And I have to say, in my own experience, and that applies whether you're in the United States or in China, whether you're in Latin America or Southeast Asia, the trends that we're seeing, the separation of gated communities from informal settlements, the privatization of so much of the city, this is often driven by either a lack of governance, the acquiescence of governance, but you also have problems here in the developed world in which a breakdown of governance, the acquiescence of governance to private interests, as Saskia's talked about, has produced essentially no more public housing. In the United States, we don't do public housing as a government enterprise anymore.
But our sociologists told us we shouldn't do public housing anymore. It concentrates the poor, therefore we shouldn't do it. What we came up with was a different way of creating affordable housing, use of the private sector tax credits and so forth. I'm sorry to cut in.
No, it's absolutely fine. But, and that is absolutely true, with the consequence that we, in so many cases, try to eke out some tiny benefit for the poor and the working class out of private investments. That's the model that has replaced the construction of public housing, which used to really mean also middle-class housing, because it's the middle class in many cities, not just the developed world, who are increasingly finding it difficult to live in cities, especially as cities prosper more.
We built 1 million units, by the way, of public housing.
Oh, sorry.
We only built 1 million units of public housing, and we had 100 million households.
Right. So, but the question then is, how can we create governance structures that that remind governments not just of the responsibilities to govern, but also the motivations to create decent public spaces, adequate transit and streets, adequate housing. How do we speak to these many different people in different parts of the world for whom cities mean different things, about having, as you say, a conversation, having government feel that they cannot cede to private interests the development of cities? What is the argument for government involvement?
Well, I think we have to build constituency-based groups, strengthen them so that they can represent their constituencies. It's not a bunch of individuals, but it's constituencies, and we can then have those conversations in a legitimate way. I'm going to turn to Saskia for this one.
Well, I'm not so much of an expert on that, but it seems to me that we should enable local, adding to what others have said, which is, for instance, enable local small manufacturing or construction companies to do that locally. We should sort of re-territorialize or relocalize a lot of what is involved. We should, like, I know Austin for a while in Texas. Austin was run by a socialist mayor, and he delegated a lot to the neighborhoods themselves, where you have all kinds of people who know how to do a few things, who knows what the jobs are that they have, but they have that knowledge. And so that to me seems, besides all the other things that were said, that seems, number two, an absolute serious commitment at all levels of government that the housing question is critical. And that is what we've lost. There was a time when housing, like in Europe, you still have that. Housing is seen as critical. You've got to deal with the housing question. And we are sort of not doing that so well, I would say, right? Nor are many global south countries doing that well. And the third element that is absolutely upsetting older modes and older traditions is different versions of land grabs. You know, look at a city like New York City, it almost feels like a huge system sort of installed itself in areas of the city where there used to be a lot of modest housing, and now it's all very fancy housing. That is happening in city after city. So we have literally expulsions of lower income, of modest middle classes, from places where they thought they would sort of live their lives. So the housing question mobilizes a whole set of major challenges. And I think that if we could address the housing question properly, we would be making progress in a set of other issues as well. I really think less alienation, less violence against outsiders. I mean, just sort of, I don't want to be too romantic, but I think if we really could do it, it would have a huge halo effect.
If I could just add to this a caveat and an agreement. The caveat is that you can't build something like a transport system locally. That there's a place for large scale planning.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But what I agree with you on this, and this is very important, I think, for you when you have investment decisions, planning decisions to make, that the 20th century basically privileged circulation over habitation. Money went into transport, less money than should have went into housing. And if there's one policy recommendation in the Quito Papers for places without much money, not like China, but like Vietnam, it's that it's more supportable to have traffic jams than it is to have housing without plumbing. And we should be putting our efforts in places with little money into housing before we put it into circulation. This is not a good This is not a good choice because it has implications for the economic development of urban economy. But one thing that I became really convinced of as a result of 3 years of research on this is if you don't have enough money, the first thing you should do is put it into housing. And that's I would say, an overwhelming recommendation of most of the discussions we had in Quito. Build fewer highways.
That makes me nervous when you say housing only. Because what we're doing is what we need to do is build communities, not just housing. We've had policies where we focused on housing only, and look what we've gotten. So we need to be thinking about all the things that make a community, and that maybe it's equitable transit-oriented development. People talk about it. It's providing the schools, and it does get back to this idea of providing sufficient public space for community uses. So we have to have space for schools, we have to have space for parks and streets, as well as housing. So it's not just housing.
I like the fact that you included photographs of in the Quito Papers of a town in the West Bank near Hebron, where I went, which created, in negotiations with the residents there, a conservative community of a public space where there had been none. And what was interesting about that, I think I spoke to the architects, and I spent a good deal of time there talking to residents as well, was that, and it gets to this point about housing, this is a refugee camp, which is of course not a formal city or town, and therefore never was built with the intention that it have any urban qualities, much less amenities. But of course, over the course of 50 years or so, it has become a place, multi-generational, which people identify with, even if they still talk about going home. And so the conversation about creating public space became a conversation about the very nature of their identity, of place, of home. And it raised issues about the relationship among men and women there, young and old, whether there was a notion that women should, in that community, have a public space where they would be seen. So I'm echoing your point by saying that that very successful effort, which created a place where children could play, people could get married and gather, also became the forum for a conversation about the nature of that community itself, its goals, its identity. And I think this is what public space can ultimately do. But I keep coming back to this question, which is, just to say one other anecdote, I remember in Quito running into the mayor of Mexico City. And I had just been in Mexico City, and he had shown me these, not he, but some of his administration had shown me places where the city had tried to improve public space, pedestrianize streets, create bike lanes, do all these things that were climate sensitive and so forth. The federal government in Mexico did everything it could to undermine those efforts. He was potentially going to run for president. They were representing in the federal government completely different interests. This is not only an American problem, it's a problem in many other countries. So I get back to this question of how, because I think this conversation needs to actually take place on the ground, how we deal with these questions of governance, which can't simply be argued by saying this is a good thing. I think it has to come back to the ways in which a majority of people are helped by this, and that the economies of these cities and countries are also served, including those private interests who now have too much of the capital. I keep coming back to this because I think this is something that people need to take away as a practical measure.
So let me get another message on to you. So I think that one critical factor is that our cities have really changed. It used to be that in some ways there were simpler economies. Today you have all kinds of non-urban sectors, from mining to, which have very big imprints in a city. So the question of governance of a complex urban terrain, if you want, really needs to be revisited. I think you said that, and I completely agree with that. Right now it seems to me that tools are missing. And every now and then you hear a smart mayor address that. And I saw this in Chicago, smart mayor, a bit corrupt, and that willingness to be corrupt enabled him to transform that airport, in the middle of the city into Green Park. Because there was no law that went either way, so to speak. So I think we're talking about a somewhat foundational revisiting and reconstituting of what urban governance means. And the third point is that cities have become far more strategic spaces. We know that when you privatize and deregulate the economy, a lot of stuff no longer runs through governments. It is direct commerce, so to say, or investment or whatever. And cities often lack the tools to handle that properly. So that would be some.
All I'm saying is I think it's the rules of the game. And this is what the New Urban Agenda talked about. There are three things that it's a very simple recipe the New Urban Agenda has, which is basically urban governance, getting the governance right, not just urban, managing spatial development, and getting the means of implementation, which is financing and knowledge sharing, capacity building. But let's go back to this governance picture. It's not just the cities that need to get the rules right. It is at every level of government, whichever the arrangement is in a particular country. The rules have to be there. If they're not there, what can you expect? And so that is a basic principle.
And if I may say, I think the arguments are the economies of countries are improved enormously because of the growth of cities, the increasing importance of cities. By making sure these cities function, you cannot have cities that are only for the wealthy or that are completely divided between the poor. We know for a fact that functioning cities need to have all different kinds of people able to support themselves, and as you said, mixed really. So there is an economic argument, there's a prosperity argument to be made even for people who are not in the cities. I want to raise one other issue. You talked a lot about Athens and cars, and I think for many people around the world who haven't thought about this much, they would say, well, in the last century, progress, as Ricky Burdett was pointing out, progress was regarded as moving out of cities, which were dirty places, providing people with green and open space, and the new technology, the new idea, was the automobile. And the notion of having one's own home and a green space was not considered some sort of attack on the city. It was seen as an opportunity for people. This was a goal. It wasn't just an American goal, because we see around the world this remains the model. I think you point out in the Quito Papers that even faster than the growth of the population is land use, which is very alarming because of the climate and environmental challenges that poses. But here we have this question of, you're saying we need a different model. We need to return to the notion that the dense city is actually a healthier place. How can most people trust this? Now, this is the new line. The last line was the car in Athens and the big towers in the park. Now you're saying, okay, shouldn't have believed us back then, but now believe it. Why should we believe it now?
Michael, how can I arouse trust? You referred to one aspect of this project, which is quite important, which is the relation between densifying the city and questions of climate and efficient use of energy. As just a statistical fact, one of the interesting things about urbanization today in places like Mexico City is that the city is de-densified. The densities are falling as you have forms of spread. And we tried to document that. It's counterintuitive, but we tried to document it fairly robustly. And you should believe me that the city should become more dense, because it's the only way to use energy resources efficiently. And urban space. But I'm just responding to this. It is true, you can say people don't want this, right? They want to live in suburbs, leafy suburbs, don't see your neighbor. Blacks never enter the perimeter of the gated community, and so on. But there is an element of this. I think that gated communities should be outlawed on ecological grounds, because it's justice ground. The only way that we can address, and this is a discussion we had between the people in Paris and planning for urban habitat, the only way to really use the city positively as an element in dealing with climate change is to redensify it and make it more compact. And people may not want that. Too bad. It's something that needs to be done, and it takes the will of government to say this has to happen.
19th century city was an awful place. It really was.
Horrible.
TV, crowded, no services, etc. It really was awful. And so the lure of green, sunny places was very strong. So knowing that Richard wants us to have compact cities, says we're going to do it regardless, we have to think about why would people want to live in a compact city? How do we make that compact city an alternative that's a consumer alternative that is useful? It's got to have the open space that's useful. It's got to have the walkability. It's got to have the amenities that will make it competitive with the suburban space that people might live. And so I think we have to think about that. We also have to think about the fact that we have suburban spaces. How can we make those spaces more practical, more energy efficient, if you may, or more urban, if we are trying to work on sustainability. So it's what are the amenities that we have to make this attractive?
And this has you've thought a lot about why people are leaving the countryside, what is forcing them out, and what the economies of the rural areas are as a consequence. Obviously, they're coming to cities because they're looking, in many cases, for opportunity. That's where the jobs are. They're driven there often by desperation, but they need to find something in the city. They're looking to support their families. They're looking to educate their children. That in itself is driving the growth of cities. What is the motivation of the cities to want more of those people?
Well, it varies a bit, and some people are not wanted. And not everything is like New York and London, let's put it that way, right? Big cities that can actually integrate a lot more people than they have in many senses. But there is an emergent new history, and it's going to hit cities harder and harder. It's already hitting. And that is massive land grabs. Richard, don't start laughing, because he knows that I'm now really into land grabs. So this is an invisible history from the perspective of the urbanite. You don't see the land grabs. Secondly, it's partly invisible because the people are being expelled. We're talking of at least 1 million in the global south every year. Those are very rough estimates. Where do they go? They go to the big slums. Now the slums, at the center of the slum, they tend to be reasonable economies, especially that is close to the normal economy. But at the edges, there are spaces of complete misery, and you see this in Rio de Janeiro, you see it in African cities. So if these land grabs continue, and really most of the land is now privately owned by the Nestle's, the Coca-Colas, the mines, the et cetera, plantation economy that has risen. So we are facing an emergent set of conditions for which cities are absolutely not ready. And I don't know how it's going to go. I mean, again, the United States is a huge country. Europe is a bit different. They know how to urbanize properly. But now I'm thinking about other parts, Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. And that is something that I think urbanists need to address. They need to address these millions of people who are being expelled from their land. They don't want to leave their land. They're being thrown out.
So the last question is, how do we persuade people of the goodness of the common good? We're talking here a lot about this notion of the common good.
You don't have to persuade them, they know. Some of the images that we have in the films, and they know when it's there and they know when it's not, whether that's in the slum or whether that is in a modest neighborhood or whether that's in a very fancy suburb. I do think that we don't need to persuade them.
What do you mean by the common good?
The common ground. I thought you said something which is shared.
Okay, so what are the goods of the commons, all right? So it's the right to live, the right to be safe, the right to be healthy, the right to educate your children, the right to earn a living. All those things are the common good. And how do we create the frames in which people can get the common good? And that's the conversation, the governance question that we have, the basic amenities, the principles of the good life.
All right, did it.
You did it.
Well, I'd just like to say as a final comment on this, that I work in and out of the UN almost all my life. And one of the things that is very satisfying to me about this project, which was Habitat 3, is that I hope it spreads within the UN as a notion that rather than thinking at the nation-state level, which is our impulse, that we inside the UN, think much more at the level of the urban. And things will look different that way. Policy becomes much more concrete, and it asks different sets of questions than it does when we think at the urban level. One way to think about this was that in the past, we always looked at the local nested, like one of those Russian dolls inside the metropolitan inside the regional inside the national. And I think that way of thinking has to change, and that we need to focus on the city as a whole, as something in itself. And when I say we, I mean us in the UN. To think less about the nation state and more about the state of the city.
I want to thank you all. I think we've solved all of the problems of the world. And I would just say this is, of course, a place to have this conversation and begin the kind of governance and other issues that you're talking about, Richard. So thank you. And thank you so much, the ambassador. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to thank, of course, Ecuador for hosting this with us, Ambassador, and the panel, Michael Kuhneman, Richard Sennett, Eugenie Burdett, and Saskia Sassen for being here. Maybe another warm round of applause for them. Just a quick announcement. We will continue this debate across the streets with civil society. It's on the church center on the 8th floor. We'll continue talking about the urban agenda and exactly engaging in a more interactive dialogue with all of you. So hope you can cross. There's no need for a security pass. You can just go across and go in. And the book that we started to pre-launch here will be out later, probably in a month's time. There are some forms on the side of the room if you're interested to pre-register your interest in the book. Just pick up a form from the side of the room and possible discount if you do so now. Thank you.